The road to Ashford Hollow. The wind carried the smell of rain and something else, something metallic, faint but inescapable. In the dim light of an autumn dusk, the Appalachian ridges seemed to crouch closer to the winding trail, their leafless branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. By the time Reverend Alice Barrow caught sight of the first lantern glow from the settlement below, his horse was stumbling from exhaustion. Riding behind him, wrapped in a patched quilt, were his twin daughters Eliza and Mercy, 9 years. Old and silent as stones. They hadn't spoken a word since leaving the last township, 2 days earlier. It wasn't shyness. It was the dreams again. He could tell by the way Mercy kept glancing at the shadows in the trees, her lips moving in silent replies to questions no one had asked aloud. Eliza, usually the braver of the two, was gripping his coat in a way that reminded him of a drowning person clinging to driftwood. Ashford Hollow was supposed to be a place of refuge. Supposed to be. From a distance, the settlement looked like a postcard of frontier stability, smoke curling from chimneys, tidy cabins. Clustered near a modest clapboard church, the kind of place where neighbors trusted each other enough to leave doors unlatched. But the Reverend had been on the circuit long enough to know that small towns kept their secrets better than any city. And Ashford Hollow, he'd been warned, had one in particular, a story so poisonous the elders insisted it had been buried 30 years ago, and better left that way. As his horse slowed at the edge of the single muddy street, Elias glanced down at his daughters. Mercy was staring straight at the church, her expression unreadable. Eliza's face had gone pale in the lantern light. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Elias's answer came without looking at him. "They're still in there." The arrival, though. Reverend hadn't been invited to Ashford Hollow. Traveling ministers seldom were. But a letter had found him 2 weeks prior, written in a spidery hand and sealed with a wax stamp he didn't recognize. The message was brief. Reverend Barrow, if you value truth above comfort, come to Ashford Hollow before winter. Ask no questions until you arrive. You will be given lodging. It was signed only with the initials W.P. now. As he dismounted in front of the church, the door swung open, and a man in his late 50s stepped out. He was tall and thin, with a scholar's bearing, though his coat was patched and his boots muddied. "Reverend Barrow?" the man asked. Elias nodded. "I'm Pastor Whitlock," the man said, extending a hand. "We've been expecting you." There was something in his tone relief tinged with hesitation that made Elias uneasy. Inside, the church smelled faintly of damp earth, despite the potbelly stove glowing red at the front. Eliza and Mercy followed their father in silence. There, small boots leaving prints in the wooden floor's thin layer of dust. Whitlock offered them a simple meal cornbread, beans, a pot of chicory coffee, but the twins barely touched it. Elias noticed they kept glancing at the raised platform where their pulpit stood. It was Mercy who broke the silence first. "You covered it up?" she said softly. Whitlock froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon?" "The trapdoor," Mercy continued, still staring at the floor in front of the pulpit. "You nailed it shut, but the smell still comes through." The whisper beneath the floor later that night, Whitlock gave them a room above the church, a small space with 2 narrow beds for the girls and a cot for Elias. The wind rattled the shutters. And somewhere below, in the darkness of the empty sanctuary, the Reverend thought he heard something scrape softly against the floorboards. At first, he told himself it was a loose shutter, a branch against the siding. But when the sound came again, slow, deliberate dragging, he saw Eliza's eyes open in the dim light. "They're trying to come up," she whispered. Elias crossed the room and knelt beside her bed. "Who?" "The ones they left down there," Eliza replied, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Go back to sleep?" Elias said gently, though his own skin prickled cold. But neither twin slept. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. And then, so softly that Elias wondered if he'd imagined it, a voice, a child's voice, rose from somewhere beneath the church. God help us. A question of trust. The next morning, Elias found Pastor Whitlock in the church kitchen, stoking the fire. The older man avoided his gaze, but Elias pressed. "What's under that floor?" Whitlock's jaw tightened. "Nothing you need concern yourself with. Ashford Hollow has its history, same as any place. But we've made peace with it." "My daughters say otherwise," Elias replied. That earned him a sharp look. "Your daughters are unusual," Whitlock said carefully. "The sort who notice things better left unnoticed. If you value your welcome here, Reverend, you'll keep them from talking about matters that don't concern them." Elias knew better than to push further, not yet. But he noticed Whitlock's hands shaking as he poured coffee, the grave that wasn't that afternoon. The girls wandered the churchyard, while Elias spoke with some of the townsfolk. Ashford Hollow's residents were polite but distant, their conversations full of safe topics, the weather, the harvest, the coming winter. Not one of them mentioned the church or anything that might be hidden beneath it. When Elias finally went to find the twins, he saw them kneeling by a row of graves near the back fence. "This one's empty," Mercy said as he approached. Stone was weathered, the name half faded. Sarah Langley, 1802 to 1820. "How do you know?" Elias asked. "Because she's still under the floor," Eliza said. "And she's not alone." The Reverend glanced back toward the church, its white paint flaking in the gray light, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. If the twins were right, and he had learned never to dismiss them, then Ashford Hollow's secret wasn't just a matter of history. It was a matter of the dead, and the dead were not at rest. And tomorrow night they would make themselves known. The voices in the floor. By the time the second night settled over Ashford Hollow, the wind had shifted. It carried a different smell, now less of rain, more of the earthy, damp rot Elias had once known from the graves back in Kentucky's floodplains after a spring thaw. That scent always meant one thing. Something buried was finding its way to the surface. The girls ate quietly at the table Pastor Whitlock had set for them in the church. Kitchen corn mush with a drizzle of molasses. Slices of smoked pork. Eliza kept pushing her food to the edge of her plate. Mercy didn't touch hers at all. Elias tried to draw them out with harmless questions about the day. Did they meet any other children? Had they seen the mill pond? But the twins only exchanged those silent glances that meant they were sharing more with each other than with him. Finally, Mercy spoke without looking up. "They know you can hear them now." Whitlock, sitting opposite Elias, set his fork down a little too hard. "Who knows?" he asked, his tone careful. Mercy looked at him then, her pale eyes unnervingly steady. "The ones under the floor." Rumors and rot that afternoon. Elias had taken a quiet walk through Ashford Hollow, listening to the way people talked when they didn't realize they were being overheard. He'd heard fragments, half-phrases, abrupt changes of subject whenever the church came up. One woman at the general store whispered to another about the Hollow night in 1820, then turned and spotted him and switched immediately to talk of pickling beans. A young farmhand, when asked if he attended Sunday services, mumbled something about bad luck in that building and excused himself. The Reverend had learned long ago that a community silence could be louder than any shouting. And yet, the silence in Ashford Hollow seemed like the kind born of fear, not just of scandal, but of something still active, something that could reach out from the past and touch the living. The sound returns that night, long after Whitlock had gone. To bed, Elias sat awake on the cot upstairs, his Bible open in his lap, though his eyes had drifted from the page. The sound came again from below, a faint scraping, like wood sliding against wood. This time, it was followed by a muffled thump. The twins were both sitting up in bed now. Number. One had spoken, but they moved as if in response to some silent summons. Elias whispered, "Stay here," but they rose anyway, feet bare on the cold boards. They padded across the room to the small door that led down to the sanctuary. The Reverend hesitated only a moment before following. The church below was dark, except for the faint moonlight through the high windows, silvering the rows of pews. The sound came once more scrape, thump, and then a whisper so low Elias could barely tell which direction it came from. "Down here, Mercy's warning," Mercy stepped forward until she stood just before the pulpit. "It's not just bones," she said quietly. Eliza, beside her, nodded. "They kept other things that belonged to them, so they'd remember." Elias felt his skin prickle. "Remember what?" Both girls looked up at him in unison. "What happened that night?" Before he could ask more, a sharp rap sounded from outside the church. Door 3 deliberate knocks that echoed in the wooden room. Elias turned toward the sound, heart thudding. Whitlock appeared in the shadows of the aisle, looking as though he'd been roused from sleep. "You shouldn't be down here after dark," he said, his voice sharper than Elias had ever heard it. "Not you, Reverend, and especially not them." The hollow night the next day, Whitlock was waiting for Elias alone in the kitchen, a folded sheet of parchment in his hand. "This is the record you came here for," he said without preamble. "But if you read it, you need to understand. You won't be able to walk away. Once you know, it will follow you." The paper was a page torn from an old church ledger, dated December 24th, 1820. It spoke of a fire, though not one that destroyed the church, and of a necessary burial, carried out before dawn, without ceremony. No names were listed, only the phrase, "for the safety of the hollow." Before Elias could press for details, Eliza walked in from the yard, her hands dirty to the wrists. "I found it," she said simply. "What?" Elias asked. She opened her palm to reveal a small brass button, green with age, its shank broken. Mercy followed her inside, holding something else, a child's hair ribbon, faded to a ghost of its original blue. "They were just under the soil," she said, "near the fence, but they want you to see the rest." That night, the twins refused to sleep upstairs. "They want to show us something," Eliza said, pointing toward the sanctuary. Against his better judgment, Elias followed them, down into the dark. They crossed the room in silence and stopped before the pulpit. The boards here were old, their nails rusted, the wood slightly warped. Mercy crouched, pressing her ear to the floor. "They're ready," she whispered, and then Elias heard it too. Not just the scrape, not just the thump, a chorus of voices, small, overlapping, urgent, rising from beneath the boards. "Let us out." The trap door. The following morning broke under a sky the color of lead. A damp mist clung to the hollows, swallowing sound and muting the thin daylight until Ashford Hollow felt like a place suspended outside of time. Pastor Whitlock did not. "Come to breakfast." Elias found a note at the kitchen table instead, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. "Do not enter the sanctuary without me. Do not disturb the floor. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut." The Reverend folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. He'd been a circuit preacher long enough to recognize the tone of a man who feared more than scandal. Whitlock feared consequence. Eliza and Mercy were waiting at the bottom of the stairs, already dressed, their hair neatly tied back. "They're louder today," Mercy said, as if reporting the weather. Eliza added, "and they're ready for you to see them." The first pry the sanctuary was dim, the cloudy daylight spilling across the pews in weak shafts. The pulpit sat like a sentinel at the far end, the warped boards before it darkened with age. Elias knelt and ran his hand across the floor. He could feel it immediately, one board that flexed slightly under his weight. The nails, once flush, were rusted and lifted at the edges. The moment his fingers touched it, the air seemed to go colder. Mercy knelt beside him. "Here," she said, pointing to a hairline gap where the plank met its neighbor. "That's where the air comes through." Eliza, silent until now, held out something wrapped in a scrap of cloth, a small iron pry bar she'd borrowed from behind the church. Elias hesitated. "If we open this, there's no going back." Mercy didn't blink. "That's the point." The hollow beneath, the first nail came free with a groan, the sound echoing through the silent church. Elias worked the others loose, each one resisting as though they, too, knew what they were guarding. When he finally lifted the board, a rush of air hit him, cold, damp, tinged with something faintly sweet and horribly wrong. A square of darkness yawned beneath the opening. The twins leaned forward at the same time, peering down into the space below. "It's not empty," Eliza murmured. Elias lowered himself to one knee, letting his eyes adjust. At first, he saw only the packed earth. Then the shapes began to emerge, fabric, rotted and sunken. The glint of something metallic. The faint, unmistakable curve of a child's skull. Interrupted before he could react, a shadow moved across the doorway. Pastor Whitlock stood there, his face pale, his voice tight. "Close it," he said. "Now." Elias rose slowly. "You know what's down there." Whitlock's eyes flicked toward the twins, who hadn't moved from their place by the opening. "I know enough." "And I know you don't want the rest." Mercy spoke without looking up. "There are 4 of them, and they've been waiting a long time." Whitlock's face drained of what little color it had left. "4?" he whispered, as though the number carried its own curse, thought Eliza finally. Looked at him. Not all of them died the same night. The ledger's missing pages later, while Whitlock locked himself in his study, Elias searched the church's modest archive, old ledgers, sermon notes, baptismal records. He found a gap in the 1820 ledger, 3 pages cleanly torn out, dot in the margin of the next surviving page. A faint note had been scrawled in a different hand, not recorded by order. Eliza stood at the doorway, watching him. "They want you to put it back together," she said. "They want people to know the truth, all of it." Mercy added, "And they don't want you to wait too long. Something's coming." That night, the mist rolled back in, thick enough to blur the lamps along the street. Elias sat awake with the pry bar across his knees, listening to the building creak, and subtle dot, the twins had fallen asleep in their beds. But he could hear them murmuring in their dreams half-formed words, fragments of names. Then, from beneath the floor, something shifted. Not a scrape, not a thump. This time, it was footsteps. Slow, measured, coming toward the opening. And when they stopped, a voice spoke up from the darkness below, low, ragged, and far too close to the surface. "You took one of ours. Now we'll take one of yours." 4 names. By morning, the mist had swallowed Ashford Hollow entirely. You couldn't see the next cabin over, only the pale blur of lanterns bobbing in the distance, and the sound of boots on wet ground. Past her, Whitlock avoided Elias entirely, slipping out before breakfast and returning after dusk. But the townsfolk, so guarded before, had started watching the twins openly now, their glances quick and uneasy, as though half expecting Eliza or Mercy to say their name aloud in front. Of everyone, the Reverend knew that look. He'd seen it before in other towns, right before a secret burst into the open. A look that mixed dread with the guilty, relief of someone who's been waiting years for the truth to be spoken. It was mid-morning when the first accident happened. Young Daniel Frya, wiry boy no older than 12, had gone to draw water from the community well. A neighbor later said she'd seen him pause, tilt his head as though listening, then step up onto the well's stone lip. By the time she shouted, he had fallen in. When they pulled him out, sputtering and shivering but alive, he said something that made the hair rise on Elias's neck. She said I could come play. Daniel insisted, eyes darting toward the church. She said she had a ribbon just like mine. Mercy's voice was quiet, but certain. That was Sarah. Whitlock snapped at her to hush, but Elias saw the tremor in his hands. Got 4 under the floor that night. The twins sat cross-legged on the sanctuary floor, just above the spot they'd pried open days earlier. There are 4 of them, Eliza sighed. 2 went in together. 1 came later, and one never belonged here at all. Elias crouched beside them. Names, he said. Can you give me names? Mercy's lips moved, as though she were listening to someone else speak. Then she looked up. Sarah Langley. Tobias Vance. Mary, she didn't have a last name. Not here. And she hesitated, frowning. The last one says she's still alive. Whitlock, standing in the doorway, stiffened. That's enough, he said. You have no idea what you're stirring up. The name that shouldn't Beatty. Next day, Elias found himself in the general store, speaking quietly with the owner, Mrs. Hensley, about the ledger's missing pages. She claimed to know nothing, but her hands shook so badly, she dropped a tin of coffee beans. Then Eliza walked in, and without preamble said, Mary didn't drown. You told them she did, but she was already dead when you threw her in the creek. Room went still. Mrs. Hensley's face collapsed into something between grief and fury. Who told you that? She demanded. Eliza didn't answer. She didn't have to. The pattern by the week's end, the accidents had multiplied. A man nearly crushed when the mill's grinding wheel came loose. A young woman found in the road, dazed, claiming she'd followed the sound of a baby crying. Each time, the twins could name which of the 4 had called to them. It's not just them wanting to be found, Mercy said one evening. They're angry now. The longer you wait, the worse it gets. Elias felt the truth of it. The air in Ashford Hollow had changed thicker, charged, as though the place itself were holding its breath. It was near midnight when Elias, unable to sleep, stepped into the sanctuary. The moonlight fell across the pulpit, pale and cold. Loose board in front of it was open. He knelt, heart pounding, and peered down into the dark. The space below was empty. No skull, no fabric, no metallic glint, only fresh earth, and a small footprint pressed deep into the soil. Behind him, a voice. He knew too well Whitlock's, spoke from the shadows. She's not down there anymore, Reverend. The one who walks. The footprint beneath the church was small, child-sized, but too fresh for something that had supposedly been buried for decades. The packed earth around it looked damp, as though it had been disturbed within hours. Elias stood frozen, his breath clouding in the cold air of the sanctuary. Behind him, Pastor Whitlock's voice sounded even quieter than before. She's not down there anymore. Whitlock said again, she can move now. Whitlock's confession in the small hours of the morning, with the lamps turned low. Whitlock finally spoke the truth. His words came haltingly, as though he'd been rehearsing them for years, but still feared the sound of them. Sarah, Tobias, Mary. They died here, wrongly, quickly. But the 4th, he paused, swallowing hard. The 4th was different. She wasn't dead when we put her in. Elias stared at him. You buried someone alive? Whitlock shook his head sharply. Not me. I wasn't here then. My father. And the others. She was a child, brought here by strangers passing through. No one knew her real name. She didn't speak, but he glanced toward the floorboards. She had a way of knowing things she couldn't have known. They were afraid of her, said she was touched by the devil. Eliza's voice came from the doorway, calm and certain. She's not dead. Not in the way you think. The first visit the next night, the hollow went unnaturally still. Not just quiet, the kind of stillness that made Elias think of deep winter nights before a storm. The twins had been restless since sunset. standing at the church windows and looking toward the tree line. She's out there, Mercy whispered Dot when Elias asked who. She only said, the one who walks. It was after midnight when he woke to the sound of small footsteps in the hallway outside their room. He rose, thinking one of the girls had gone to the kitchen, but when he stepped into the hall, it was empty, and yet the floorboards were still settling, as though someone had just moved past. Mary's warning the following day. Eliza began speaking in a voice that wasn't her soft, trembling, almost too faint to hear. She's angry, a voice said. She doesn't want the others to rest. She wants them to speak forever until everyone hears. She wants you to open the ground. When Elias asked who was speaking, Eliza's eyes rolled slightly and her own voice came back. Mary says don't trust her. Mary says she's not like us. Mercy added, she doesn't want justice. She wants more company. The disappearance 2 days later, a boy went missing. Jacob Reed, age 8, last seen walking home from the mill pond. Search parties scoured the woods, the creek banks, even the abandoned mine shafts, but found nothing. The only clue came from an elderly neighbor who swore she'd seen Jacob walking with a little girl in a white dress toward the edge of town. She said the girl's hair was long and dark, and she'd been barefoot despite the cold. When Elias showed her a faded church sketch of the unidentified child buried under the floor, the woman's hand shook so badly she dropped it. That's her, she whispered, but that's impossible. That night, Elias found the twins waiting for him in the sanctuary. The trapdoor was open again, the space below lit by a single candle. She left this for you, Eliza said. Pointing to something lying on the earth beneath Dot, it was Jacob Reed's knit cap, damp and streaked with fresh soil. Mercy looked up at him, her voice barely more than breath. She says if you want him back, you have to trade. Betrayed, the candle's flame guttered in the breath of cold air, seeping from the space beneath the church. Jacob Reed's knit cap lay in the dirt like a challenge, the damp wool smelling faintly of creek water and something older, something that didn't belong in the living world. Elias stared at it for a long moment before speaking. What does she want? She wants out, Eliza said. Her eyes were fixed on the dark below the floor. Completely. No more boards, no more ground between her and the air. Mercy added, she says she'd give Jacob back if you give her the door. The door? Elias asked. The place you open so she can step through, Mercy replied. The place you promise never to close again. Whitlock's last stand, Pastor Whitlock, was waiting in his study when Elias found him. He looked older than he had a week ago, his hands trembling as he poured coffee neither of them would drink. She won't keep her word, Whitlock said flatly. If you open that space, she won't just take Jacob. She'll take whoever she wants. She always has. You knew she could leave? Elias asked. I knew she could wander, Whitlock admitted. But she always came back. The floor kept her bound to this place. Break that, and she'll roam until there's nothing left here but empty houses and missing children. Elias considered this, the weight of the choice pressing in like the mist outside. And if I do nothing? Whitlock's gaze fell. Jacob will join the others. The breach that night, the town gathered for the search's final meeting. Rain lashed the windows of the church as men reported on each fruitless lead. Jacob's parents sat pale and silent in the front pew, their hands locked together. Elias rose and crossed to the pulpit. He didn't speak to the people. He spoke to the air, to the darkness beneath the boards. You can have what you want, he said quietly, but you give him back first. The floor creaked under his feet. A sound that was almost a laugh. He knelt, gripped the loose plank, and wrenched it free. Then another. And another. Soon the opening was wide enough for a child to crawl through, or for something else to climb out. The candle below flared as though fed by a gust from nowhere. The returned Jacob appeared first, crawling up from the dark, his clothes damp, his eyes wide but clear. He stumbled into his mother's arms without a word. A hush fell over the church dot, and then behind him, a pale figure rose from the opening. A girl in a white dress, her hair dripping with something that wasn't water. Her face was young, but her eyes were black wells without bottom dot. She stepped onto the sanctuary floor and turned her head slowly toward Elias. "You kept your word," she said in a voice that was both childlike and ancient. He met her gaze. "Now, leave," she smiled faintly. "I will, but not far." The hollow empties in the weeks that followed. Ashford Hollow began to change. The accidents stopped. The voices under the floor grew silent. But families began leaving anyway. They said the nights were too quiet now, that they'd seen a barefoot girl on the road at dusk, watching the houses. Pastor Whitlock left without a word. His cabin stood empty until it collapsed under the weight of the first heavy snow. Elias and the twins stayed through the winter, tending the church until the congregation dwindled to nothing. By spring, Ashford Hollow was a ghost town in all but name. Final twist, they were packing to leave when Eliza found something tucked under her pillow. A blue ribbon, fresh and clean, tied in a perfect bow. Mercy came to the doorway, holding in hand identical ribbon. "She says she's coming with us," Mercy said. Elias stared at the ribbons for a long time, then at his daughters. Neither looked afraid. "She likes the way we listen," Eliza added softly. They stepped outside into the pale spring light, the empty street stretching before them. Somewhere far behind, in the church they'd left unlocked, a single floorboard creaked. Some say Ashford Hollow still stands, though you won't find it on any map. Others say it was swallowed by the forest years ago, its buildings collapsing into the earth. But there are stories, whispered in other towns, of a barefoot girl in a white dress who walks with a pair of twins. She never speaks to anyone else, but if you see her, you'd best keep your children close, because some trades never truly end.